So you have this awesome idea involving dark dungeons and huge ferocious beasts. But how do you get that idea into a concept? And more importantly, how do you make that concept into a game? I'm gonna give you 5 steps to follow after the break.
Welcome to SRD, where our second-rate production will make you a first-rate GM.
So let's get started and talk about the difference between an idea and a concept. So an idea is that original light bulb that you have go off in your head like, man, it'd be really cool to have a pirate game. But a concept is the steps that you're gonna take to get there.
So you've got this idea for a game where you know the torture that you want to send your players through, but you haven't quite ironed out exactly what that's going to involve. Sometimes you want to start them off in different settings, or maybe you want to move them from one dimension to another, but you haven't got all the details ironed out. The first question you got to ask yourself is, why are you being the game master? I know that for me, it was because I saw the game master having all this kind of fun with things besides the player character, and I wanted to be able to control things besides the player. I wanted to be able to control who the monster was, what was the campaign, the city, all the background characters, and you get more control, you get more influence on the story. Not that the players don't have an influence, but the game master is the one that paints the entire background of what's going on. And so that was the big reason why I decided to become the game master.
Me, I had a game master who was very flaky, and he didn't always show up, and we had a really good group of players. We all loved the game, but he just wouldn't show up. So one day I was like, you know what, the hell with it. I'll do it, it can't be that hard, right? I was wrong, of course, and it took me a long time to figure out the nuances that go along with it. Finding your reason to becoming a GM is really what's important, because if you're doing it and you don't want to, you have no desire to, just stop. Just stop. Just hang up, forget it, put down your cards, and either let somebody else do it or give up the hobby. Because if you're going to try to GM when you don't want to or you have no desire to, you're going to make it miserable for everybody around you. And that's just going to hurt any future endeavors that you might have. The next thing that you want to talk about or think about is your audience. Who are you playing this game for? Is it your friends? Is it complete strangers? Is it going to be at a store setting? We have much more of a formal setting like Pathfinder Society or D&D Adventure League, those kinds of things. We have to follow box rules. Or is it just going to be at home where you can have all the fun and games that you want to have?
A lot of times, depending on who your audience is, completely changes how the game's going to work. Because if you have friends that all they want to do is slaughter monsters, and then if you go to a store and you have people that want to spend the entire time having a conversation with people in a tavern, that'll completely change what kind of concept you're going to be doing. I had a gaming group for actually about a decade where I knew that if they didn't have at least one realm of combat during that gaming session, they were going to be annoyed and disappointed. There was a couple of times where I didn't have any combat and they actually came back and complained to me about it. And so whenever I designed the adventure, I always kept in mind what actually made them happy and what were their expectations. Not just my own expectations, but you have to keep the players in mind as well, because if they're not having fun, the game's not going to survive. But when you're working on your concept, that's something to think about. If you have a group of players that like to slaughter monsters, you're probably not going to want to put them in a situation that involves lots of diplomacy or working in courts or in a city setting unless it's very aggressive type of setting.
Yeah, so in contrast to that, when you're doing convention games, for example, you're going to put out that information before you meet your players. So in Kayvon's case, in that particular game, he knew his players, he knew what they liked. In a convention setting, you don't know those players, and you're not going to know them until they sit down at that table. So what you want to do is put out a very vanilla game. That way it's kind of good for everybody. It's not necessarily the taste of this player or the taste of this player, but something that's going to be broad for everyone. You want to really think about your setting. You know, is it going to be a sci-fi game? Is it going to be horror? Is it going to be high fantasy, low fantasy? Making sure that you get your setting, what your players are looking for, and what fits inside of that idea that you originally had. It's really important. You don't necessarily want to have a pirate game that's set in a modern setting. You could try it, and it might be cool, but that's not going to be your typical expectation from your players are looking for.
When you work on your setting, that's where you're going to add some of the details in the background that kind of help sell your game session or your campaign, because if you're not exactly sure what your setting is going to be when you're putting it together, or if you're trying to do a hodgepodge, that's going to make it difficult when you actually put in the details that actually sell the game to the players.
Selling into your players is something we're going to talk about in our next episode.
Next is the tone of the setting. So are you going to do humorous? Is it going to be serious? Is it going to be a mixture of both? Or are you just going to play it on the cuff? And is it all going to be dependent upon the attitude of the players when you guys sit down at the beginning of each session?
A humorous game can be a great way to break up some of the other games you've played. You don't always have to play a very super serious game. It doesn't always have to be Lord of the Rings or some of these other high fantasy games. Have a good time on occasion. There's nothing wrong with the Beer and Pretzels game.
The other thing about tone is that actually drives other things that we have to worry about, which is what kind of system you're going to use, playing to your audience, because sometimes you might have people that they only want serious games. They don't want humor. They might not want you to crack jokes in the middle of your gaming session, so you have to keep that in mind when you work on the other concepts.
Yeah, that is. And that actually takes us into our next point, which is what system best fits your entire concept. If you're looking at having a pirate game that's got a little bit of a theme, a horror theme to it, but the tone is maybe slightly humorous at times, you're going to have a difficulty finding the system that matches that. Don't pick D&D as your default setting. I know we all like Dungeons & Dragons. It is my favorite as well. However, it doesn't always fit. If you're really wanting that high seas adventure kind of game that might have a little bit of horror to it, definitely some ship battles and those kinds of things, there are systems out there for that. 7th Sea is a fantastic one and it's everything that you're looking for and focuses maybe a little bit more on the role play than some of the other games.
Sometimes the concept drives the specific system you need to run. Like if you're doing a hodgepodge where you actually want to do modern day setting using fantasy races, you're going to have a hard time finding systems that'll actually do that. You might have to actually hunt around for something that's more generic, like GURPS, for example, which is great for really wild, crazy ideas that you have in mind that mix a bunch of things together.
And there's nothing wrong with adapting your favorite setting. There are plenty of times that I've taken Dungeons & Dragons and I have adapted the ideas and the concept that I've had to make it fit into D&D. But honestly, then I learned about other games, right? And then I tried some other things and I realized that if I wanted to play, for example, a zombie undead game, that there are better systems for that. There's End of Days and there's Outbreak. Why am I going to do all of this work over here with this system when this system already has what I need? And it's a lot easier to take things out that I don't want than to add a ton of more work into it. So once you've got these 5 things that we talked about, why are you GMing? Who is your audience? What is the setting, the tone, and what is the system that best fits? Get it on paper, whether it's on your computer, your laptop, Google Drive, Sheets, whatever it may be. Get that concept down so that you can work on it. There are plenty of times that I've come up with games and ideas that I didn't necessarily get to right away. Hell, I've got a whole closet full of them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Me too.
So stick around. Our next video is all about selling your concept. And I know we touched on it briefly a couple times during this video because that's the point, right? It's the 6 steps of GMing. It are the things that we all do. But before we leave, what are some awesome concepts that you guys have come up with in the past? And don't forget, there's a like and subscribe button down there. If you like us, if you want to see more, consider hitting those. Thank you very much. Have a good week. Starting is the worst. What's the magic of that again? Intro music. Welcome to SRD, the channel that makes you a first-rate GM by giving us. Nope, we're not giving us anything.